The letter arrived on a damp Thursday morning, the kind of morning St. Mary Mead often wore like an old shawl, soft grey skies and the faint scent of wet earth. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her knitting needles dancing quietly, between her fingers tilted her head curiously at the envelope. Cream-coloured, thick paper. A familiar hand. It was from Emily Cartwright, an old school friend now living in the Cotswolds. Miss Marple opened it delicately. "Do come, dear Jane," it read. "There's something terribly unsettling here at Thornhill Cottage. Nothing the police would bother with, of course, but I know when something is wrong. And you always see things others don't." The next afternoon, Miss Marple stepped out of the hired car and into the brisk Thornhill air. Thornhill Cottage stood as Emily had described in her letter, ivy curling around honey-coloured stone, a thatched roof weathered by time, and an air of quiet dignity. Emily greeted her with warmth, but her eyes carried a troubled weight. "It's not just the teacup," Emily said as they settled inside the sitting room, where the fire snapped softly in the hearth. "It's how it was broken. It was my favourite, the Wedgwood one, shattered on the floor after tea with Henry and my niece Clara." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes already scanning the room. "Did it fall accidentally?" "That's just it. No, one recalls knocking it over, and more than that, Clara was pale, almost frightened after it broke, and Henry, he's been acting so oddly." Henry Denville was Emily's brother-in-law, a retired colonial officer with an air of formality that always struck Miss Marple as slightly theatrical. Clara, on the other hand, was a sweet, intelligent girl of 23, recently returned from a spell in London. Miss Marple met them both that evening over dinner. Conversation flowed lightly at first. Village news, the vicar's new sermon series, but when Emily asked casually about the broken teacup, a hush fell. Henry's hand paused mid-air with a forkful of partridge. Clara's eyes flicked down. "It was just an accident," Henry said quickly. "The maid must have knocked it while clearing." "We weren't finished when it happened," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple made no remark but stored the detail carefully. That night she wandered quietly into the sitting room where the incident had occurred. The fire was out, but moonlight lit the room gently. She knelt near the carpet. The broken pieces had been cleared, but she saw the faint scratch marks on the floorboards, odd, parallel lines not caused by porcelain. Something had been dragged. The next morning, Miss Marple joined Emily in the garden, ostensibly to enjoy the roses. But she asked gently, "Has Clara seemed herself lately?" Emily hesitated. "She's been withdrawn since returning from London. I thought it was the end of her engagement." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Who was the young man?" "A solicitor's assistant, name of Thomas Berridge." Clara ended it suddenly. "Didn't say why." Miss Marple nodded. Something deeper lingered beneath the surface. She asked to speak privately with Clara. They met in the conservatory, the sunlight warming the tiled floor. Clara seemed nervous, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers. "Miss Marple," she began, "I'm not sure what you've heard, but the teacup didn't break by accident. I saw Uncle Henry push it. He was angry." "Why?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara's lip trembled. "Because I told him someone had been in the bureau. The drawer where Aunt Agnes kept her papers. Aunt Agnes died last spring, and there were rumours she'd left a letter. Something about a change to the will. Uncle Henry insisted no such letter existed, but I found a piece of it, burnt in the grate, just a corner with her signature. And that evening, before the teacup broke, I said I might show it to the solicitor. That's when he pushed the cup, not at me, but it was a warning." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "I see." She asked Emily discreetly to call the family solicitor. The man arrived by evening, a stout gentleman with tired eyes and a cautious tone. Miss Marple posed a simple question. Was there ever a codicil added to Agnes Denville's will? There was a letter she'd spoken of, months before her death. Said she was leaving the bulk of her estate to Clara, in gratitude for her care. But I never received any documentation. The will stands as it was. Henry inherits everything. Miss Marple asked him to remain. That night, she called for everyone in the drawing room. I think, she began gently, that Agnes Denville did write that letter. But someone made sure it would never reach your hands. Henry scoffed. Really, Miss Marple? I believe she left it here, in the bureau. And I believe Clara found the remains, burnt, but not entirely. She pulled from her handbag a small envelope. Inside was a soot-smeared fragment, one Miss Marple had retrieved from the fireplace with delicate tweezers the night before. The solicitor examined it. Agnes Denville's handwriting, he confirmed. And a signature. Miss Marple turned to Henry. You broke the teacup to silence Clara, not out of rage, but to frighten her, to distract everyone from what was about to come out. Henry's eyes blazed, then dropped. Silence clung to the room. The codicil, if burned completely, may be lost, the solicitor said gravely. But with testimony and handwriting, the court may yet act. In the weeks that followed, the estate went into legal arbitration. Clara, though shaken, found strength in the truth. Thornhill Cottage grew quieter, and Miss Marple, back in St. Mary Mead, resumed her knitting with a small, satisfied smile. Because sometimes justice begins not with a scream, but with a teacup falling to the floor, and the quiet mind of a woman who sees everything. Rain pattered. Gently on the slate roof of Thornhill Cottage the following morning, a whispering rhythm that seemed to hush the countryside into listening. Miss Marple stood at the kitchen window with a thoughtful expression, her tea forgotten on the counter. Behind her, Emily watched her quietly, recognizing the glint in her friend's eyes, the soft, focused look that always came when Jane was unraveling something unseen. I do wonder, Miss Marple murmured, why Henry was so sure no letter existed. Not just confident, certain. That sort of certainty usually comes from knowledge rather than belief. Emily nodded but said nothing. The solicitor had departed late the previous evening, promising to return with his handwriting expert. For now, the house was subdued. Henry remained in his study, the door shut tight, and Clara had taken to her room with a heavy silence. The tension in the air was growing thick, like the storm threatening beyond the hills. At mid-morning, Inspector Craddock arrived from the local constabulary. A solid man with a kind face and the quiet patience of someone used to listening before speaking, he shook hands with Emily and asked to speak with Clara. Miss Marple offered to make tea and quietly recused herself from the interview, but she listened from the hallway, not out of rudeness, but experience. One learns more by hearing what is said when someone thinks no one else is listening. Clara's voice was muffled but clear enough. Yes, I told Miss Marple what I saw. No, Uncle Henry didn't touch me, but he meant to frighten me. He said terrible things about the letter, about what Aunt Agnes wanted, that it was just sentimental nonsense, and I was too young to understand inheritance law. There was a pause. Craddock's voice followed, low and measured. Did you see the letter in full? No, just a burnt corner with her signature. I kept it. Miss Marple has it. Later, Craddock joined Miss Marple in the sitting room, taking her measure silently for a moment before speaking. You've stirred quite the dust cloud, Miss Marple. The solicitor corroborates the claim, but if the codicil is gone, this could come down to interpretation and testimony. Miss Marple offered him the salvaged fragment, now pressed carefully, between sheets of wax paper. He examined it briefly before setting it down on the table between them. I'd like to walk through the events of that evening again, he said. May I? Of course, Miss Marple replied, though I suspect you'll find that the key details have been carefully buried. They began in the drawing room. Craddock noted the scene. The armchairs, the low table set for tea, the bureau, tucked into the far corner. The rug had been turned slightly, revealing the faint drag marks Miss Marple had noticed. He crouched to examine them more closely. "This is odd," he murmured. "Not caused by shoes or furniture. Looks like something heavy was dragged and then returned." Miss Marple nodded. "I suspect so. I also suspect that whatever was dragged was not meant to be noticed. It's quite easy to miss, unless, of course, you knit. Knitters always notice snags." She pointed gently at the fringe of the rug. One of the threads had been pulled free, caught on something coarse and metallic. Craddock raised an eyebrow and carefully traced it to a narrow slit in the wood panelling beneath the bureau. Together, they shifted the bureau aside. Behind it faintly, a groove in the wood ran horizontally, almost like a hidden compartment, though its edges were sealed. "I'd need a carpenter for this," Craddock muttered, "but someone's definitely tampered with this wall." Miss Marple's eyes lit with a quiet spark. "Aunt Agnes may have left more than just a letter. It's just the sort of thing she'd do, an old-fashioned sense of drama. She loved puzzles, you know." Craddock requested the local carpenter at once. In the meantime, he took another walk through the room, scanning for anything that felt out of place. He paused by the mantelpiece. Among the usual array of porcelain figurines and silver-framed photographs sat a small, mismatched item, a plain iron key, dustless, recently handled. "Did this belong to Miss Denville?" he asked Emily, who had just entered with a tray of biscuits. Emily frowned. "That's strange. No, it isn't one of hers. I'd never seen it until 2 days ago. I assumed it was one of the gardeners and meant to return it." Miss Marple took it gently. "It's too delicate for a shed, but perhaps for a drawer. Or a lockbox." As if summoned by thought, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "I know that key. Aunt Agnes used to keep it on a ribbon in her sewing basket. It locked the drawer in the writing bureau." Craddock moved immediately, unlocking the drawer Clara indicated. Inside, only dust and a thin layer of faded velvet lined the bottom. He ran his hand along the velvet. His fingers paused, then slipped. Beneath, a soft click. From beneath the false lining, he withdrew a bundle of paper, edges singed but mostly intact. At the top of the first page, addendum to last will and testament. Agnes Henrietta Denville. The room went silent. Miss Marple watched Henry from across the doorway. He had just emerged from his study, clearly unaware of what they'd found. But something in his face shifted, flickered, when he saw the papers in Craddock's hand, a tightening around the mouth, a brief, involuntary jerk of the eye. "Mr. Denville," Craddock said evenly, "did you know about this compartment?" Of course not," Henry replied too quickly. "I told you already, no such letter existed." "And yet," Craddock said, holding up the pages, "it seems your sister-in-law took care to hide it, not destroy it." Miss Marple stepped forward. "You see, Inspector, I believe Mr. Denville did know it was hidden. I believe he found it after Agnes's death. But since it named Clara the heir, he chose to burn it. Unfortunately for him, he left behind the key, and a piece of the evidence he meant to destroy." Henry's mouth worked silently, caught between indignation and calculation. Then he tried another tactic. That girl, Clara, she was always interfering, always prying. Agnes was weak toward her. But Clara stood her ground. "I was the one who stayed with her when she was ill. You were in London, drinking with your club." Craddock stepped forward. "Sir, I'll ask you not to leave the property until we conclude our investigation." As the rain began to fall harder outside, the weight in the room deepened. But so did the clarity. The shadows that had hung over Thornhill Cottage were thinning, dissolving into truth. Miss Marple watched it unfold quietly, her gaze drifting once more to the window, because truth, like rain, always finds a way in. The following morning, with the rain still drumming its quiet rhythm against the windows, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock gathered everyone in the drawing-room for a final round of questioning. The evidence now before them, the will, the hidden compartment, and Henry's increasingly erratic behavior, pointed to a truth that none could escape, but the tangled web of lies still held them all tightly. Henry stood by the window, his arms crossed, avoiding direct eye contact. Clara sat at the edge of a chair, her fingers tightly gripping the arms as if she were preparing to bolt at any moment. Emily remained by the door, her expression a mixture of concern and guilt, watching everyone closely. It was as though the entire room held its breath, waiting for the next misstep. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, calm and unhurried. "We all want to understand exactly what happened on the night your aunt died. The events that followed, the finding of the letter, the strange disappearance of the key, and the broken teacup in the hallway, all of these things seem to lead us in different directions. It's important that you all share your memories, as honestly as possible." Clara spoke first, her voice still faint with nerves. "I told you everything I know. Aunt Agnes was upset that evening. She kept talking about her will. She said she'd made changes. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" "And where was your uncle?" Craddock asked, his tone direct but not accusatory. Clara shifted uncomfortably. "He was in his study. He wouldn't come out, not even when Aunt Agnes was calling for him." "And you didn't think it odd that he didn't check on her?" Miss Marple asked gently, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. Clara's gaze faltered, and she looked away. I thought he was angry with her. She had been upset with him. Over money. They'd fought." "Money," Craddock repeated thoughtfully. "That seems to be the common theme. And what did you do after your aunt called out for Henry?" "I went to the kitchen. I was making tea. I didn't think anything was wrong. I didn't think it was the last time I'd see her alive." Clara's voice trailed off, a crack of emotion creeping in. Henry's voice suddenly broke in, sharp and defensive. "That's enough, Clara. I've already told you. There's nothing to be gained from this. We're wasting time." The outburst caught everyone by surprise, and the tension in the room thickened. Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on Henry, and for a moment she considered him carefully. His sudden aggression was out of place, a small crack in his carefully controlled demeanour. "Tell me, Mr. Denville," Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering, "where were you on the night your sister-in-law passed away?" "I was in my study," as Clara said. "Working. Alone." "But not entirely alone, I would assume," Miss Marple pressed. "The door to your study, did it remain locked all evening?" Henry hesitated. I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because of the broken teacup," Miss Marple replied, her gaze never leaving his. "It was found just outside your study door, you know. In the hallway, close enough to suggest someone may have been leaving your study when it was dropped." For the first time since his arrival, Henry looked caught. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, an internal struggle clearly playing out. "I don't know. I was alone. Perhaps Clara," Craddock interjected, his voice tight with suspicion. "You mean you don't know where she was?" "I don't see the point in dragging this out. We're all grieving," Henry said, his voice rising. "We should just move on." Craddock studied him for a long moment, then shifted his attention to Emily. The subtle exchange of glances between the two women did not go unnoticed. Emily was nervous too, but her eyes were clear, unclouded by the same defensive sharpness Henry exhibited. "Miss Carlyle," Craddock said, addressing Emily directly, "you've been quiet for most of this. I imagine it's because you have something to add." Emily swallowed as though preparing herself. She stepped forward, her posture straightening with resolve. I don't have much to say, but I know something's been off with Henry for some time. After Agnes's death, he seemed too eager to take control, too quick to push the rest of us aside. And why would that be? Miss Marple asked, softly, watching Emily closely. Because Henry's the one with the most to gain, she said, her voice steady but soft. He was always obsessed with the inheritance, even when Aunt Agnes was alive. I don't think he ever liked the way she divided her estate. I don't think he was ever happy with the idea that Clara might inherit her share. Emily's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Henry's face went pale. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy with implication, and it was clear to all present that Emily was only scratching the surface of something deeper. But Henry recovered quickly, his voice steady, though colder now. Emily, that's preposterous. You know very well that Agnes's will was something we all discussed openly. I never wanted to control anything. I was merely making sure Clara had what she needed. And yet, Miss Marple interjected, her voice suddenly sharp. You weren't exactly forthcoming with the contents of the letter, were you? You didn't want Clara to know about it, did you? Henry's eyes flicked to Clara, a brief, involuntary glance of guilt before he caught himself. I didn't want her upset. The will was already being challenged. There was no reason to add fuel to the fire. A lie. Everyone could feel it. The words sounded too rehearsed, too forced. Miss Marple looked at Clara again, who had been unusually quiet, her gaze still locked on her uncle. Clara, tell me something, Miss Marple said gently. Have you ever seen your uncle look at the will? After Aunt Agnes passed, did he ever speak of what it contained? Clara shook her head slowly. No, he never let me see it. He kept it hidden. I thought he was just being protective of the family's privacy, but now... She trailed off, her voice breaking. Now, Miss Marple concluded, we understand that there was something else he was hiding. Something he didn't want you to see. Henry flinched, though he tried to mask it with a scowl. I don't have to listen to this. No, Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming with the sharp clarity of truth. But I do believe the truth will listen to you. At that moment, the front door creaked open and a man stepped into the room, muddy from the rain. He had the appearance of a local tradesman, rough around the edges, but there was something about his steady gaze that caught Craddock's attention. I'm the carpenter, he said, his voice firm. I've had a look at that panel behind, the bureau. There's more to it than meets the eye. The puzzle pieces were shifting again, but this time they were starting to click together. And somewhere, deep inside Thornhill Cottage, Miss Marple felt the final thread of the mystery pulling tight. The carpenter, a gruff man named Arthur Blake, made his way into the centre of the room, his boots leaving muddy prints on the polished floor. He carried a small weathered toolbag slung over his shoulder, and his hands were raw from handling wood all day. Miss Marple's eyes flicked from the man to the others, noting the shift in atmosphere. Whatever Blake had to say, it was important. Go on, Mr. Blake, Craddock urged, his voice low but eager. What have you found? Blake set down his bag with a quiet thud and retrieved a length of timber from inside it. There's something behind the panel in the study. It's been sealed for years, but I managed to get a look. Everyone's eyes turned toward him, Clara's in particular, her anxiety mounting. She had always believed that the study was Henry's sanctuary, a place where he could be alone, a place where no one dared to invade. But now, with each passing moment, her trust in him was crumbling piece by piece. The panel's been covering up a small compartment, Blake continued. Inside there's a box. It's old, covered in dust. I didn't open it, but there's something about it, something that shouldn't be there. Who's been in the study recently? Craddock's voice sharpened. Henry's eyes darted to Blake, then to the others, before settling on Miss Marple with a cold, defensive gaze. "That's preposterous. I've kept the study locked. I don't know what you're talking about." "But—" Miss Marple saw through the bluff. "Mr. Denville, your words are hollow, and your discomfort betrays you. The truth is closer than you think. You've concealed something, and it's time you face it." Blake continued, his voice steady, but hinting at unease. "I didn't think it was my place to open that box, but it wasn't hidden well enough. Anyone could have found it." "Where exactly did you find this compartment?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Blake shifted, uncomfortable. "Behind the bureau. It wasn't easy to access, but with a bit of work." "Well, I could see it. The panel had been disturbed, the edges worn away. Someone had tried to open it before me." "Who?" Craddock pressed, his voice a little more forceful now. Blake hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure, but whoever, didn't get far. I could see where the screws had been pulled out, and the panel had been loosened recently. It wasn't me." The tension in the room thickened as the implications of Blake's words settled in. Miss Marple's mind was already turning, analyzing each statement, each small detail. There were too many questions, too many contradictions. The secrets within Thornhill Cottage were like the rooms themselves, filled with hidden corners and things long forgotten. Henry's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking nervously between Miss Marple and Craddock. "You're wasting your time. There's nothing in that study but old furniture and books. Whatever you think you've found, it doesn't change anything." Miss Marple turned to face him fully, her expression soft but unyielding. "But it changes everything, Mr. Denville. It's not just about what's been hidden. It's about why it was hidden, and by whom." The silence in the room was deafening. Even Clara looked lost, her mind racing. What could her uncle be hiding? Was it something more than money? Something more than the inheritance that had always seemed to haunt their family? "I think it's time we reconsider everything," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but commanding. "The events of that night, the will, the teacup, the strange behavior of each person here, it all leads to one inescapable truth. Each of you has a motive, but the question remains, who acted upon it?" Craddock shifted in his seat, his hand resting on his chin as he processed the detective's words. "There's greed, of course. Henry's the one with the most to gain from Agnes's death. But what about you, Clara? You stood to inherit something too. And Emily, it seems like you've always been hiding something." Clara jumped at the mention of her name, her face pale. "What do you mean, hiding something?" "I mean," Craddock said slowly, "you've been distant, almost too distant. You've barely spoken to anyone since the death. What's more, your answers don't seem to add up. Why didn't you try to stop Henry from getting to the study first? Why didn't you go there yourself when you heard the disturbance that night?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She seemed stunned, caught off guard. Her usual calm was gone, replaced by unease. "I don't know what you're implying, Inspector," she finally stammered, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes. Emily, who had been watching the exchange with increasing anxiety, spoke next. "That's not fair. Clara wasn't the only one with a motive. Henry was always obsessed with the money. But it wasn't just that. There's something else, something darker that I'm not telling you." The room stilled as Emily's words echoed through the space. Every eye turned to her, waiting for more. She swallowed, her fingers trembling as she glanced at the others. "I never told you everything, but I know Henry didn't act alone." Blake, standing quietly off to the side, seemed suddenly uncomfortable. "What's this about, then? I've told you everything I know. I didn't know what was going on in that study." "You're right," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her eyes meeting Emily's. "Henry didn't act alone, and neither did Clara or even you, Emily. All of you had something to hide, And that's what makes this so complicated. You each had a reason to act, but each reason was different. Greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear, they all came together that night. Henry's eyes were wide now, his defensiveness replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. This is madness. It's the truth, Mr. Denville, Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the weight of finality. And the truth is that your motives were not as simple as you think. It wasn't just money, it was control, power, and the desire to erase the past. The pieces were coming together, though the web of lies still stretched before her, tangled and confusing. Clara and Henry had been driven by different forces, Clara's resentment of the will, and Henry's years of festering ambition. Emily's involvement too was becoming clearer, though Miss Marple knew she hadn't yet uncovered the full extent of what had transpired that night. But one thing was certain. The mystery of Agnes Denville's death had been carefully planned by those who felt they had something to gain or something to lose, and it wasn't going to be easily untangled. Miss Marple, still calm amidst the rising tension, turned back toward the study. Let's see what else we can uncover in that compartment. I believe the answers we need are buried inside. Miss Marple stood quietly in the study, her eyes narrowing as she examined the small compartment hidden behind the panel. Blake, now more than a little agitated, lingered by the door, his hands wringing together as he watched the detective's every move. The others remained outside, their curiosity palpable, but Miss Marple knew better than to rush. The box Blake had discovered sat on the floor, old and covered in dust, its wood darker from years of neglect. It was simple, unadorned, but its very presence spoke volumes. She bent to inspect it, carefully brushing off the dust before lifting it. The weight of it felt significant, as though it held secrets not easily shared. Craddock, having been informed of the discovery, arrived at the door, his voice eager. "What have you got, Miss Marple?" She didn't answer immediately, her fingers running along the edges of the box. There was no lock, but it had been sealed with great care, as though whoever placed it there had no intention of it being opened any time soon. Her mind raced. This could be the breakthrough they needed, or it could be another dead end. Finally, she opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded velvet, was a small collection of papers. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned them quickly, absorbing every detail. The first sheet was a faded letter, its ink smudged with age but still legible enough to read. It was a letter of correspondence between Agnes Denville and a solicitor, discussing terms for a revised will. The date was several months before Agnes's death, but the details, particularly the mention of a substantial sum of money to be transferred upon her passing, piqued Miss Marple's interest. Craddock stepped into the room, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Looks like we've found it then. A new will. The old one, the one that left everything to her nephew Henry, might be void." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She continued to sift through the papers. The letter seemed to suggest that Agnes had planned to change her will, but the specifics were unclear. There were no signatures, no final statements, just vague instructions. It was a start, but it didn't tell her everything. She had a nagging feeling that this was too clean, too convenient. Henry, standing just outside the study, had been listening intently. His posture had shifted since the discovery of the box, the usual arrogance replaced by uncertainty. "What is it? What's inside?" "It's a letter," Craddock answered, his voice practically bubbling with excitement. "A new will. Looks like Agnes was going to change things before she died." "I didn't know about any new will," Henry said quickly, his voice too sharp. "I never saw it. I don't know anything about it." Miss Marple glanced at him, sensing the subtle tremor in his voice. "You didn't know, Mr. Denville? Or are you just pretending?" Henry's eyes flicked toward her, his jaw tightening. He took a slow step backward, as though distancing himself from the conversation, but Miss Marple didn't let the moment pass without noting it. He was reacting, perhaps more than was warranted, but before she could say anything more, Craddock jumped in again. "We'll take this straight to the solicitor. This changes everything. The case is practically solved." But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She studied the papers again, feeling a sense of unease grow within her. Everything about this discovery felt too neat, too perfect. Her mind turned over the possibilities. Could it really be that simple? Had Agnes's death been the result of a simple dispute over inheritance? Was that what had driven one of these people, Henry, Clara, Emily, even Arthur Blake, to murder her? No, Miss Marple muttered to herself, but the others didn't hear. Her instinct told her that there was more to this. The real story was still hidden beneath the surface. "Miss Marple, do you think we've got our man?" Craddock asked again, his impatience showing now. "This will certainly point us in the right direction." She turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "It's a start, Inspector, but it's not enough. There are still too many unanswered questions. This will maybe the key to motive, but not the motive itself. Someone is hiding something." Despite her words, the authorities were eager to make their move. They began contacting the solicitor mentioned in the letter, their voices filled with a sense of accomplishment. The room buzzed with the energy of what they believed to be the solution to the case. But Miss Marple felt the weight of her thoughts. She had seen this before, the rush to judgment when things seemed too easy. She was certain now that they were being led down a carefully constructed path. The next morning, Craddock arrived at Thornhill Cottage early, his usual energy replaced by a sense of finality. He entered the study where Miss Marple was already seated, her eyes scanning over the letter again. "Well, it's done," he said with a smile that barely masked his relief. "The solicitor confirmed the new will. Henry's out. The estate is being transferred to someone else. It's all there. We've got our answer. The case is closed." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her thoughts clouded with doubt. The authorities had everything they needed, everything they believed would put an end to it. But something wasn't right. The way the letter had been so carefully hidden, the exact timing of the discovery, the sudden rush of information, it all pointed to one thing. Someone was controlling the narrative. "I'm glad to hear that," Miss Marple said finally, her voice measured. "But I'm afraid the case is far from closed, Inspector." Craddock raised an eyebrow, his expression one of surprise. "What do you mean? We have the will, we have the motive, and now the estate will be settled. This is over." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "It's never that simple, Inspector. This letter is an important clue, but it's not the key. We're missing something. Someone wanted us to find this, to think we had the solution. But we haven't uncovered everything yet. The true criminal is still among us." Craddock shook, his head frustrated. "Miss Marple, sometimes you have to accept the obvious." But Miss Marple wasn't so easily swayed. She rose from her chair, walking toward the window, her eyes sweeping over the garden outside. "I'll accept the obvious, Inspector, but not until every piece of the puzzle has been put together. And something tells me we're still missing a crucial part of the picture." The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became. The case had seemed to fall into place too quickly, too perfectly. And now, as the authorities moved forward with what they thought was a clear-cut solution, she knew that the real criminal was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, her gaze drifting over the faint scratches in the old wooden table. The case had been progressing so smoothly, too smoothly, but there was something she couldn't shake. The pieces seemed to fit perfectly, yet the image they formed didn't feel right. There was something missing, something old, perhaps forgotten, that could offer the final key. She had seen it before in other cases, and it was usually a detail no one considered, because it was buried beneath the weight of new evidence. Her thoughts turned to the past, to the time when the cottage had been alive with bustling activity. She knew that Thornhill Cottage had a history, a lineage of occupants, but Miss Marple felt as if the key was buried deeper than anyone had realized. Was it in the family's past? The house, once filled with laughter and music, now seemed to hold only silence and secrets. As she sat contemplating, a memory surfaced, something she'd overheard during one of her earlier conversations. It had been a casual remark made by Clara Denville. At the time, it hadn't seemed important, but now it echoed in Miss Marple's mind, growing more significant by the minute. Clara had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that her late mother, Agnes Denville, had once been involved in a particularly sensitive legal case. "It was before my time," Clara had said, "but it made quite a stir in the village, something about inheritance disputes, and some people saying Agnes had wronged them. That had seemed trivial then, just another family story. But now, Miss Marple wondered if it was a clue, a fragment of something long buried that had resurfaced. The more she thought about it, the more it connected to the faint memory of Agnes's younger years, a time when Thornhill Cottage had been at the heart of a scandal. She rose from her chair and moved to the side table, where she had kept a few of her notes. There, buried among them, was a faded newspaper clipping from a case that had shocked the village years ago. She hadn't thought to look at it before, but now it felt like the missing piece. The headline read, "Local heiress accused of fraud in 1920s inheritance case." It was the same name, Agnes Denville. The article detailed a bitter dispute over the inheritance of a large estate. Agnes had been accused of withholding a significant portion of a family fortune, and although no one had ever been able to prove the accusations, the scandal had marked her family for years. The case had dragged on for months, and while the public never truly learned the details, the case had left its imprint. Agnes had never spoken about it, but the whispers followed her. Miss Marple's hand trembled slightly as she set the clipping aside. So this was the secret Agnes had carried with her. It had never truly gone away, lingering in the corners of her life, and now spilling over into the present. The more she considered the old case, the more it seemed clear. This was where the roots of the current tragedy lay. Agnes's past was tangled in this mystery, and if the wrong people learned the truth, it could destroy them all. With new resolve, Miss Marple turned her attention to the people involved. The Denville family had been fractured, divided by long-held resentments. Clara, the eldest, had always been distant, careful to keep her interactions cordial but not warm. Arthur Blake, the family solicitor, had maintained a professional demeanor throughout, but Miss Marple sensed a coldness in him that went beyond business. And then there was Henry, the nephew. He had been too quick to distance himself from his aunt's death, too eager to claim the inheritance. But now, Miss Marple's attention shifted back to Clara. Something about her earlier comment now rang in her ears, like the toll of a distant bell. She had mentioned that her mother's past had been linked to the inheritance dispute, but the detail of how much Clara knew remained unclear. Had she learned the truth about Agnes's involvement in the scandal? And if so, had Clara been hiding? Something about her own role. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Clara was the key, perhaps unwittingly, but the key nonetheless. If Clara knew about her mother's troubled past, perhaps she had a motive for murder. After all, a past like that, once exposed, could ruin everything. But there were still too many unknowns. The webs of deceit ran far deeper than anyone could have imagined, and Miss Marple felt the weight of that knowledge settle in her bones. The next day, she sought out Clara. The younger woman was seated in the drawing room, a distant expression in her eyes as she looked out the window. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across her face. She turned as Miss Marple entered. a polite smile playing on her lips. "Miss Marple," Clara greeted her, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice. "I trust you're finding your investigation to be fruitful?" Miss Marple smiled, faintly, her mind already at work. "It's certainly revealing, Miss Denville. I've learned a great deal about your family's history, particularly a case involving your mother. An inheritance dispute, I believe. I imagine it must have been a rather difficult time for your family." Clara's eyes widened ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair. "My mother never spoke of that. It's an old case, one that should have been left in the past. I imagine it must have been difficult for you, growing up under the shadow of such a scandal," Miss Marple continued, watching Clara carefully. "Perhaps even more so when your own inheritance was brought into question." Clara's gaze flickered to the window, her lips pressed together as though she were trying to suppress some internal struggle. Finally, she spoke. "My mother was a complicated woman. I don't know if she ever regretted her actions in that case, but I don't think she ever fully understood the consequences either. Do you think it was her guilt that drove her to change her will?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but insistent. Clara's face remained unreadable, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders. "My mother's guilt was her own, Miss Marple, but perhaps she did believe that she could atone for it in some way. The will. She was trying to do what she thought was right." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Clara's. But did she truly believe she could make amends? Or was it simply a way to hide the truth, to silence the ghosts of her past? Clara's expression shifted, a brief flicker of something dark crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but I can assure you, Miss Marple, that I had no part in my mother's death. None at all." Miss Marple studied Clara for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "I understand, Miss Denville, but I believe there's more to your family's story than you're letting on. Perhaps the truth is closer than we think." As Miss Marple left the room, her mind was made up. Clara knew more than she was willing to admit. The shadows of the past were rising again, and the truth was closer to the surface than ever before. Miss Marple stepped back into the study, her thoughts swirling like the ever-thickening fog outside Thornhill Cottage. Clara Denville's words were still fresh in her mind. The young woman had been defensive, cautious even, but Miss Marple felt there was more to uncover. The past, dark and twisted as it was, had a way of clinging to the present, revealing itself at the most inconvenient times. It was time for a shift in approach. Miss Marple had always believed that people, when faced with the right stimuli, would inadvertently reveal their true selves. If they felt safe, they might slip, let their guard down, and expose a crack in the veneer they so carefully constructed. Clara's avoidance of direct answers was revealing in itself, but Miss Marple knew that she needed to approach this from a different angle, one that would unearth the truth without causing her suspects to close ranks. The detective's mind turned over the details of the case, the inheritance dispute, Agnes Denville's controversial past, and the strange reaction of Clara. Something had happened in the past to shape her character, and there was more beneath the surface. If Miss Marple could figure out what that was, she could turn the tide in her favor. A thought crossed her mind, a psychological tactic, one she'd used once before with success. Miss Marple wasn't one for theatrics or tricks, but she knew the value of subtlety. She would push Clara just enough, using her own curiosity and seeming disinterest, to see how the young woman reacted. Sometimes it wasn't the question that mattered, but the response, or rather the lack of one. That evening, Miss Marple arranged to meet Clara once more. She didn't mention the past case. Instead, she framed the conversation around something far less threatening, her own interest in Thornhill Cottage. She mentioned the history of the place, the strange feeling it gave her as she walked through the halls, and how it seemed to hold memories, unspoken but palpable. Clara, who had seemed so composed earlier, now looked startled, as if the very mention of the house unsettled her. "I can see why you might feel that way," Clara said, her voice a touch too steady. "This house has been in my family for generations. It's seen a lot, and yes, there's a certain weight to it. But that's just the way old places are, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing as she watched Clara's face. "Oh, absolutely. Old houses do have a way of holding on to their secrets. I suppose you've lived with it all your life. Still, it must be difficult, having to keep the memories of everything that's happened here. The scandal, your mother, all of it." Clara's eyes flickered. "I told you, Miss Marple, my mother didn't speak about it. There's nothing more to say." But Miss Marple wasn't deterred. She leaned forward slightly, a hint of curiosity in her tone. Of course. But I wonder, do you ever feel as though you've inherited more than just the house, the people who've lived in it, all the memories that come with it?" Clara looked away then, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't see the point in dwelling on the past. What's done is done." Miss Marple smiled softly, her tone now warm and reassuring. "Quite right. But sometimes, Clara, there's something quite powerful in understanding the past. It helps us to understand ourselves, don't you think? It helps us see why we act the way we do." Clara stiffened at the words, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the guard go up again. But this time she wasn't looking for a defense. She was looking for the subtle shifts, the betrayals of emotion that would slip past Clara's careful control. "Why do you think people keep things from others?" Miss Marple asked. Her question wasn't meant to be pointed, but it carried a weight all the same. "Do you think it's fear, shame, or perhaps something else?" Clara hesitated for a long moment, and Miss Marple saw the flash of indecision cross her face. For the first time, Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in Clara's hands. Her voice faltered ever so slightly as she spoke again. "I don't know. Maybe people keep things hidden because they're afraid of the consequences, or because they don't want to hurt anyone." Miss Marple smiled gently, as though acknowledging a quiet truth. "Yes, it's easy to see why someone might keep secrets. But sometimes, Clara, keeping secrets can have unintended consequences. Sometimes the past doesn't stay hidden as easily as we'd like." Clara looked up sharply, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it. "I don't know what you're implying. There's nothing to hide. I'm not my mother, and I don't have any secrets." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying her carefully. "Of course you're not your mother. But we all have our secrets, don't we? Even the best of us." Clara's face grew pale. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I'm sorry. I don't think this conversation is going anywhere." Miss Marple watched her leave, her suspicions growing more certain with every step Clara took. She had reacted exactly as Miss Marple had hoped, revealing more than she intended. The crack in Clara's armor had been small, but it was there, her unguarded fear when the topic of secrets was broached. Miss Marple waited for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around her. She had pushed Clara to the edge, and in doing so, she had uncovered something important. Clara wasn't as innocent as she appeared. Her reaction to the idea of secrets was not just guilt. It was something deeper, something more personal. The detective smiled to herself. Now it was time to dig into Clara's background, into her past, to see if the things she had said, albeit in passing, had any real truth to them. Clara's nerves, her defensiveness, and her slip in emotion had only confirmed what Miss Marple suspected all along. The real answer lay not in the inheritance or the house, but in a family secret, one that had been buried so deep no one had dared to speak of it, Miss Marple would not rest until the truth was laid bare. The shadows of the past were not as distant as they seemed. The next morning, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case settle even heavier on her shoulders. Clara's reaction had set off a string of thoughts that lingered, intertwining with the clues she had already gathered. But just as the detective was preparing to push forward, to dig deeper into Clara's past and family connections, something unexpected happened. Something that would send the investigation into a new, more dangerous direction. It started with a phone call. Miss Marple had only just sat down with her tea when the sharp ring of the telephone cut through the quiet of Thornhill Cottage. She picked up the receiver, her mind still swirling with ideas about Clara's nervous response. Miss Marple. The voice on the other end was strained, almost frantic. It was Officer Benton, one of the constables who had been assisting with the case. "Yes, Officer Benton, what is it?" Miss Marple asked, her curiosity piqued. It's the evidence, ma'am. The files, the documents. They're gone." Miss Marple froze for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. "Gone? What do you mean? Gone?" "We don't know how, but someone has taken them. The evidence we collected from the Denville house, the letters, the will, all of it, it's disappeared. We've searched the whole place. There's no sign of forced entry, no obvious explanation." The detective's mind raced. She had been working meticulously, piecing together the web of lies and deceit, when the rug had been pulled out from under her. That pile of documents had been her guiding thread, her link to the truth. "I need you to be calm, Officer Benton," Miss Marple said slowly, thinking through her next steps. "Have you checked every possible place? Every drawer, every file cabinet? Could it have been misplaced? We've checked everything. We even went over the whole house, top to bottom. There's nothing left. It's like someone knew exactly what we had and decided to take it." Miss Marple's heart sank. "You're telling me this wasn't a random act?" "No, ma'am, someone specifically took it. And it happened overnight, just after you left." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Someone knew what Miss Marple had been working on, knew what had to be kept hidden at all costs. "I'll be there soon," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the rush of thoughts that flooded her mind. She hung up the phone and stood from her chair, her calm demeanor belying the storm that churned within. The stakes of this case had just escalated beyond anything she had expected. When Miss Marple arrived at the police station, Officer Benton was waiting for her in the small evidence room. He was a young man, eager and earnest, but now he seemed deflated, as if the weight of the missing evidence had crushed his resolve. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes scanning the empty shelves and overturned file cabinets. "No, Miss Marple," he replied, shaking his head. "The security cameras didn't capture anything. It's as if the person knew exactly where to look, and they left no trace behind." Miss Marple took a moment, letting the room's silence settle around her. Then she spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. "Think carefully, Officer Benton. Who knew about these files? Who had access?" Benton hesitated. "Well, I suppose Clara Denville did. She was here, going over the paperwork. And then there was Mr. Holloway, the family lawyer. He was here too, but it could have been anyone," Miss Marple finished. The thought for him. She walked slowly to the back of the room, her fingers brushing against the empty shelves where the documents had once been kept. "The list of people who could have taken the files is long. But you said something important earlier, officer. You said someone knew exactly what we had." He nodded, a frown knitting his brows together. "Yes. It doesn't feel random." "No, it doesn't," Miss Marple agreed, her mind already forming the outline of the next steps. "It feels calculated. Whoever did this was familiar with the investigation. Perhaps too familiar." Benton shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think someone inside is involved?" Miss Marple paused, allowing the idea to take root. Possibly. We can't rule it out. But first, let's consider the people who would benefit the most from the destruction of that evidence. Who stands to gain if the truth remains buried? Clara, Benton suggested, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Possibly, but Clara isn't the only one with something to hide. We need to keep our options open. Let's take a closer look at her, and anyone else who might have something to lose from the truth coming out. She stood up, her mind already racing, ahead to the next logical steps. I'll need to speak with Clara again, but I want you to do something for me first, Officer Benton. I need you to track down any potential connections between the Denville family and the people who might have an interest in keeping these documents hidden. Look at past disputes, hidden deals, anyone who might have wanted Agnes Denville's inheritance for themselves. We've been focusing too much on the present, when the past is where the key to this puzzle lies. Miss Marple returned to Thornhill Cottage with a heavy heart. The missing evidence weighed on her like a stone in her chest, but she knew she couldn't let the frustration cloud her judgment. Whoever was behind the theft was still out there, watching, waiting. They had tried to bury the truth, but Miss Marple wasn't about to let that happen. As the evening crept in, Clara appeared at the doorstep, her face pale and drawn. She had been waiting for Miss Marple's return, and the moment their eyes met, the tension between them was palpable. "I need to speak with you, Clara," Miss Marple said gently, her voice steady but firm. "It's important." Clara nodded silently, stepping inside. She didn't protest, but the unease was clear in the way she fidgeted with her hands. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "What's on your mind, Miss Marple?" Clara asked, her voice strained, as if she were already anticipating the conversation that was about to unfold. "There's been a setback in the investigation," Miss Marple said quietly, watching Clara's face for any reaction. "A very important piece of evidence has gone missing, and I need to know, Clara, what did you really see that night?" Clara's eyes widened in surprise, her mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. This was no longer just about the inheritance, about Agnes Denville or the house. It was about something far deeper, a secret someone was willing to kill to keep, and Miss Marple would find it. The tension in the air was thick as Clara sat across from Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Miss Marple, ever the picture of calm, studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I understand this has been difficult for you, Clara," she said softly, "but I need you to understand the seriousness of this. Someone is going to great lengths to keep these secrets buried, and if we don't uncover the truth soon, I fear things will only get worse." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lips trembled, and Miss Marple could see the conflict in her eyes. The guilt, the fear. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Her hands tightened again, her knuckles white. "But I didn't have a choice." Miss Marple's mind raced. "What do you mean, Clara? What didn't you have a choice about?" Clara swallowed hard, then, without warning, stood up abruptly. "I have to go. I can't do this. I can't tell you anymore." Before Miss Marple could react, Clara fled out the door, her footsteps quick and panicked. The detective felt a sudden chill run through her. There was something deeper at play here, something Clara hadn't yet revealed. But before Miss Marple could give chase, a loud knock echoed from the front door. She quickly opened it to find Officer Benton, his face pale and strained. "Miss Marple, you need to come with me," he said urgently, his voice low as if afraid someone might overhear. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, stepping out onto the porch. "There's been another murder," Benton said, his eyes wide with horror. "A woman found dead in her own home. The circumstances, they're eerily similar to what happened to Agnes Denville." The words hit Miss Marple like a punch to the gut. The investigation had just taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. Another victim. It couldn't be a coincidence. Who is it? Miss Marple asked, already stepping forward to follow Benton. The victim's name is Sarah Holloway, Benton replied. The wife of Mr. Holloway, the family lawyer. She was found in her study, just like Agnes. And there's something else. He trailed off, glancing around nervously before continuing. The documents we thought were stolen, they were found in her desk drawer. All of them intact. The revelation left Miss Marple reeling. The papers had been hidden in plain sight, right under their noses. Sarah Holloway's involvement in the case now seemed more than just coincidental. She had to have known something. She had to have been a part of something much darker than anyone had realized. The two of them rushed to the Holloway residence, a grand old house nestled just outside the village. As they arrived, the scene was already swarming with officers. Benton led Miss Marple to the back of the house, where the body had been found. Sarah was discovered by the housekeeper, who arrived early this morning, Benton explained, his tone grim. It appears she was stabbed, like Agnes. There are no signs of forced entry, and there's no indication of a struggle. She must have known the killer. Miss Marple took in the scene, her eyes scanning the room for any hint of the killer's motives. She noticed a half-finished cup of tea on the desk, untouched. It seemed as though Sarah had been caught off guard, but not by someone she didn't know. There was no sign of panic or fear in the room, just an eerie calm. Benton opened the drawer and pulled out the stack of papers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight. The same set of documents that had disappeared from the evidence. Room had reappeared here, and she could see the familiar handwriting, notes that had been made by Agnes Denville herself. This changes everything, Miss Marple murmured. The killer's been one step ahead of us the entire time. We thought we were getting closer, but we were only walking into their trap. As Benton flipped through the papers, Miss Marple's mind began to race. The connection between the Denville family and the Holloways was clear now, too clear to ignore. The two families had been intertwined for years, their fates tied by more than just business or inheritance. There was something deeper here, something buried beneath the surface of their public lives. The Holloways had secrets, just as the Denvilles had. But even as Miss Marple pieced together the connections, a more pressing concern loomed. The killer wasn't finished. If they had the nerve to strike twice, they were prepared to do it again. And soon. "We need to find Clara," Miss Marple said suddenly, her tone urgent. Benton looked at her with confusion. "Clara? Why her?" "She knows more than she's letting on," Miss Marple said. "I believe she's been a part of this from the very beginning. I can't explain how or why just yet, but she's involved, in a way that we haven't seen before, and I think she's in danger." Before Benton could respond, a scream echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. Both Miss Marple and Benton turned, rushing toward the noise. The housekeeper, a frail woman in her 60s, appeared at the door, her face ashen. "Miss Marple. Officer Benton. You need to come quick," she gasped, her voice quivering. "It's Clara. She's gone. She's disappeared." The detective felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was the break she had been dreading. Clara's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. She had been taken, perhaps by the killer, or perhaps someone else trying to silence her before she could talk. "Miss," Marple knew they were running out of time. "Find her, Benton," Miss Marple commanded, her voice firm. "Search every inch of this house and the surrounding grounds. We cannot afford to lose her. Not now." As Benton hurried off, Miss Marple turned back to the scene of the crime. Something told her that the key to solving this case was hidden in Clara's disappearance. The pieces were coming together, but the puzzle was far from finished. The real villain, whoever they were, had played the perfect game, and now Miss Marple was forced to fight for more than just answers. She was fighting to keep Clara alive before the killer struck again. The chase was on. The sound of Benton's hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, but Miss Marple remained motionless, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. She could hear him barking orders to the officers, telling them to search every room, to comb through the grounds. But her mind was elsewhere, focusing on the small, seemingly insignificant details that had been piling up in her mind since the first murder, the half-finished tea in Sarah Holloway's study, the papers that had been hidden in plain sight, the brief moments of hesitation in Clara's voice when she spoke. It was all adding up, though the pieces didn't quite fit together yet. Something was missing, something that would make it all make sense. Missy? Marple's gaze moved back to the pile of documents that had been left behind, documents that had once been stolen and were now inexplicably back in the hands of the police. She picked them up, her fingers tracing the edges. There was something familiar about them, a connection she couldn't quite put her finger on. They were important, no doubt, but why would someone go to such lengths to steal them and then return them? She began to sift through the papers again, this time more methodically, each note and annotation taking on a new significance. Her eyes narrowed on a small detail, a name. It appeared in several places, scrawled hastily on the margins of different documents. It was the name of a company, one that Miss Marple recognized but had not given much thought to before. Holloway and Denville, the law firm that had ties to both the Denville family and the Holloways. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Why hadn't she noticed that before? The firm seemed to be at the center of it all, linking the families in a way that was more than just business. It was personal. Miss Marple. Benton's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned to face him. But before she could speak, he added, "We've found Clara." Her heart skipped a beat. "Where?" "She's in the woods behind the Holloway estate. Unharmed. But she's in shock. We need to talk to her." Miss Marple nodded, already moving toward the door. "We don't have much time. Something is unfolding, Benton. The truth is right in front of us, but we're looking at it all wrong. We're chasing the wrong lead." Benton was quiet for a moment, then caught up to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "The name Holloway and Denville," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "It's a key to everything. We're focusing on the murders, on the violence, but the answer is hidden in the history of these families. The law firm was the glue that held them together, and now it's the battleground for a much deeper conflict." Benton was silent, but Miss Marple could feel his curiosity growing. They reached the back door of the estate and stepped out into the crisp evening air, the path ahead dark and winding. Clara sat on a bench under a tree, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were sharp, alert. As they approached, Clara looked up, her gaze flicking between them. Miss Marple took a seat beside her, careful not to overwhelm the young woman. "Clara," she said gently, "I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me everything you know. You're safe now, and we're here to help." Clara swallowed, hard, and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to run, but I was so scared. I thought they were going to kill me too. I thought if I left, they wouldn't come after me." Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, but she knew this wasn't just about fear. Clara had been part of something far bigger than she understood. "Who, Clara? Who was after you?" Clara hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It wasn't just one person, it was the firm, Holloway and Denville. They've been hiding something huge, but I don't know what. All I know is that I saw things. Things." "I shouldn't have seen." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What did you see?" Clara looked at her with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "I saw a meeting. Late one night at the office, Mr. Denville and Mr. Holloway were arguing. They were talking about some files that had information about both of their families. It wasn't just business, Miss Marple. It was something personal. I couldn't hear everything, but they were angry. And then Mr. Holloway said something that I'll never forget. He said, "If we don't get rid of it, we'll both lose everything." A chill ran through Miss Marple. Clara had witnessed the beginning of it all, the desperation, the threat. The stakes had always been higher than anyone had realized. What happened next? Miss Marple pressed. "I don't know," Clara whispered. "But I started to get scared. I didn't want to be involved, but I couldn't just walk away. I started copying the files just in case. I thought I could use them to protect myself if things went wrong. But then someone found out, and I—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I had to leave. I had to get away from everything." Miss Marple processed Clara's words, feeling the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place. Holloway and Denville wasn't just a law firm. It was a secretive, corrupt nexus where both families hid their darkest dealings. The files Clara had copied were the key, and they had somehow made their way back into the hands of the police. Someone was playing a much deeper game, using the files to manipulate events, to stir up the chaos that now surrounded them. Benton stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Miss Marple, we've found something else. There's been a shift in the evidence." Miss Marple's eyes snapped to him. "What do you mean?" "They're gone," he said simply. "The files. The ones Clara copied. They've disappeared from the house. Someone took them. Someone inside the investigation." Miss Marple felt the weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. The killer, or rather the person pulling the strings, was much closer than she had thought. The pattern was emerging, clearer now than ever before. It wasn't just about the murders. It was about power, control, and secrets. And someone in the investigation was determined to bury the truth before it could come to light. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit study, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily on her chest. Everything had led to this moment. The twisted trail of deceit, the stolen evidence, the desperate actions of those involved. It was as if a dark veil had slowly been lifted, revealing something far more sinister beneath the surface. Yet the final piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Benton entered, his face drawn, his usually confident demeanor clouded with uncertainty. He placed a file on the desk in front of her, the edges of the paper creased from being handled too many times. Miss Marple didn't need to ask. She could already feel that something had shifted. Something had changed in the case. Benton was no longer just her partner in this. He was a man now questioning everything he had believed about the investigation. "Do you know what's inside this file, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. She shook her head slowly, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "No, but I suspect it's important. You wouldn't have brought it here if it weren't." Benton opened the file, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out a series of photographs. They were grainy, taken from a distance, but they were unmistakably clear. There, in one of the images, were the familiar faces of Henry Holloway and Edward Denville, two men she had long suspected of being at the heart of the mystery. But in the next, they were not alone. In the background, barely noticeable at first, glance, stood Clara, her expression frozen in fear. It wasn't just the sight of her that disturbed Miss Marple, it was the context. The photo had been taken at a remote location, a cabin deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the Holloway estate. Benton flipped through the rest of the photographs, his eyes widening with recognition. This is from the night the first murder occurred." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind connecting the dots. The pieces had been scattered across a wide expanse, but now they were starting to come together. Clara was there. She was part of this all along. But she didn't just witness it, Benton added, his voice dropping to a whisper. She was in on it. The revelation sent a chill through Miss Marple. She had suspected Clara's involvement, but to hear it spoken aloud was another thing entirely. She had believed Clara was a victim, a pawn in a larger game, but now it seemed that the young woman might have been playing a role far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. "Why, Benton?" Miss Marple muttered, her gaze fixed on the photographs. Why would Clara, a seemingly innocent woman, be involved in this? Benton paused, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. Because, Miss Marple, Clara isn't just a victim. She's been hiding something from all of us. And I think the key to understanding her involvement lies in the one thing none of us saw, her relationship with both Holloway and Denville. Truth began to seep into Miss Marple's mind, layer by layer, as Benton continued. Clara had been working for Holloway and Denville for years, right? But she wasn't just a secretary or an assistant. She was much more. She was privy to everything. She knew their secrets, their schemes, their lies, and she used that knowledge to her advantage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. But why murder? Why go this far? Benton's expression darkened. Because Clara wasn't just involved in the firm's dirty business. She was in love with one of the men, a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool to achieve his own ambitions. The pieces finally clicked. Clara had been more than just an innocent bystander or a victim. She had been a player in a deadly game of manipulation, her emotions tangled with her ambitions. The twisted connection between her and the men at the center of this case went deeper than anyone could have anticipated. "It's not about money or power," Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. Clara was never after those things. She was after something more elusive, something that twisted her perception of right and wrong. Benton's voice was low. She was after love. She thought she could have everything. Love, security, power, all by keeping the secrets of Holloway and Denville. She thought that by helping them, she could be the one who came out on top. But in the end, she was just a pawn in their game. A pawn who became desperate when she realized she had nothing left to hold on to. Miss Marple closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all. Clara's involvement in the case wasn't driven by greed or revenge. It was driven by something far more personal, far more fragile. Clara had been caught in a deadly web of love and betrayal, manipulated by the very people she had believed would protect her. In her mind, her actions were justified. She was doing whatever it took to win their affection, to earn her place in a world that had always seemed out of reach. But in reality, her actions had led to death, destruction, and a tangled mess of lies. She thought she could outsmart everyone, Miss Marple whispered. She thought she could manipulate those around her, playing each of them off the other. But in the end, Clara became the very thing she feared most, expendable. Benton looked at her, his eyes full of both disbelief and understanding. So now what? Miss Marple took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest begin to ease. Now, we finish what we started. We've uncovered the true motive, the reason behind all of this. Clara didn't just want to survive the game. She wanted to control it, and she was willing to do anything, no matter the cost. Benton nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. Then we need to make sure the game ends before it claims more victims. They stood together in the quiet study, the weight of the case heavier than ever, but with a clear path forward. The true nature of the crime was no longer a mystery. It wasn't about a thirst for wealth or power. It was about a woman's twisted desire for control, for love, for a place in a world she could never truly belong to. And now, with the truth in their hands, Miss Marple and Benton were determined. to bring it all to an end. The final confrontation was coming, and nothing would stand in their way. The sky above the Holloway estate was heavy with clouds, the weight of the coming storm mirroring the pressure in Miss Marple's chest. She stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on the dimly lit windows of the drawing room where Clara had been summoned. Benton was inside already, preparing the final details. Everything had been set with surgical precision, each piece of the trap delicately arranged to reveal the full truth without allowing the suspect even a breath of escape. It had to end tonight. Too many lives had been shattered, too many lies allowed to flourish. Now, with the motive exposed and Clara's role finally understood, Miss Marple was ready. But this wasn't a confrontation born out of vengeance or anger. It was strategy, the final move in a long and deadly game. Inside, the room was warm, but the tension cut through the air like a knife. Clara sat on the edge of the chaise longue, her legs crossed tightly, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her eyes darted from Benton to Miss Marple as the latter entered the room and quietly shut the door behind her. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Clara said, trying to control her voice, but the strain was audible. "I think we both knew this was inevitable," Miss Marple replied evenly, crossing the room to stand near the fireplace. "You've run out of shadows to hide in." Clara let out a sharp breath, equal parts nervous laughter and disbelief. "You think I've been hiding? I've been surviving." "That's what you tell yourself," Miss Marple said softly. "But I believe somewhere in you, there's a part that knows survival doesn't come at the cost of others' lives. That part of you is why you agreed to come tonight." Clara's eyes flashed. "You don't know what they did to me, Edward." "Henry, I was never a player in their game, just a pawn until I learned the rules. And when I did, I played better." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice steady but not unkind. "You didn't just play better, Clara. You turned the entire board over. You thought you could make them need you. That if you could manipulate them, expose their vulnerabilities, you'd be safe, loved, powerful." "They made promises," Clara whispered. "Edward said he was going to leave the company, leave the country, with me. We had a plan. But then the partnership with Holloway fell through, and I became a liability. They were going to cut me out of everything." "And so you forced their hand," Benton said from the corner. "You leaked the financial documents that ruined them. Didn't you? You orchestrated the chaos so they'd turn on each other. But you didn't expect the body to turn up in the woods, or the missing ledger to resurface." Clara's jaw tightened. "That was never supposed to happen." "No," Miss Marple said, voice low. "But it did. And now you're surrounded by the consequences." For a long moment, the room was silent. Clara's hands clenched into fists on her knees. Her mask was slipping. The polished exterior, the cool, composed facade, was giving way to the frantic, cornered woman beneath. "You don't have any proof," she said suddenly, her voice cold and brittle. "No confession, no witnesses. This is all speculation." Miss Marple moved to the mantelpiece and retrieved a small black recorder. She clicked it on, and the last few minutes of a recorded conversation between Edward Denville and Clara began to play. The audio was slightly muffled, but the meaning was unmistakable. Clara's voice urging Edward to pin everything on Holloway, to disappear, to leave her the remaining assets as agreed. Clara lunged for the recorder, but Benton intercepted her, his voice sharp. "That's enough." Clara froze, breathing heavily, and stared at Miss Marple. "You set me up." "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You set yourself up. You just didn't know we'd been listening." Clara's voice cracked. "He was going to kill me. Edward, he told me I'd be the next loose end. I did what I had to do." "And now Edward is gone," Benton said. His car pulled from the river early this morning. You planted the idea that Holloway betrayed him, didn't you? And in his panic, he tried to flee. Clara blinked rapidly. I didn't kill him. No, Miss Marple said, but your games did. You put the pieces in motion. You thought if you stayed just far enough from the fire, you wouldn't get burned. Clara stood, her eyes wild, her voice rising. You think I wanted any of this? I loved him. I wanted a life, not this. You wanted control, Miss Marple said, the truth landing with a weight that silenced the room. Control over your story, your circumstances, and over the men who had once held that power over you. But control gained through destruction isn't freedom. It's another kind of prison. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank back into the chair, her face buried in her hands. What now? She whispered. There's a constable waiting outside, Benton said. You can come quietly, or we can call him in. Clara nodded slowly, defeated. I'll come. Miss Marple walked her to the door, the hallway stretching long and still ahead of them. As they stepped into the corridor, she glanced at Clara. One last time, the hint of compassion still in her eyes. You were never invisible, Clara. You were just looking for recognition in the wrong eyes. Clara didn't respond. She simply walked forward, each step heavy, the final act of her game at an end. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, dotting the stone path that led away from the estate. Miss Marple stood at the doorway, watching as the constable led Clara into the waiting car. Benton joined her quietly, his expression unreadable. It's over, he said. No, Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet. But it's ending. Behind them, the estate was silent once more, the ghosts of betrayal and desperation still lingering. But for the first time in weeks, the pieces had settled. The board was clear. And the truth, no matter how dark, had finally come to light. The rain had started to fall more heavily, a steady drumbeat against the cobblestones as Miss Marple stood beneath the archway, watching the car carrying Clara disappear into the distance. The investigation that had begun with so much confusion and chaos now felt eerily quiet, like the calm after a storm. She had the answers. The truth had been laid bare. Clara, the once charming and elusive woman at the heart of it all, was now behind bars, her motives exposed. But still something gnawed at Miss Marple, a sense of unease she couldn't shake. She had seen this before, the way a case could feel finished, only for a final, unexpected turn to upend everything. Benton stood beside her, his eyes scanning the now empty driveway, his face unreadable. We've done it, Benton said, his voice steady, but with a hint of relief. Clara's locked up, Edward's dead. The chaos she caused will stop now. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the empty space where Clara's car had just been. Something about the way everything had fallen into place felt too easy. She'd pieced the puzzle together, but she couldn't help but feel like there was another piece she was missing, a piece that didn't quite fit. I think you're right, she finally said, her voice soft, almost contemplative. But I can't shake the feeling that something's still off. Benton raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to her. What do you mean? Miss Marple didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back toward the estate, her eyes narrowing. As they passed over the dark windows, she couldn't explain it, but it was as if something had shifted. The lingering tension in the air, the weight of the unanswered questions, it was all still there. We've dealt with Clara, she said, her tone sharp now. But we haven't dealt with the full story yet. There's still one thing that doesn't make sense. Why didn't she go further? Why stop with the financial ruin, the games, the manipulation? It didn't add up. Benton stepped closer, his face clouded with confusion. I'm not following you. Clara was the mastermind. She was behind everything, was she? Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it carried a sense of conviction that immediately made Benton pause. He looked at her, his brow furrowing. You're suggesting someone else was involved? I don't know yet, Miss Marple murmured, turning her attention toward the large wooden doors of the estate. But there's a piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit. Clara played her part, yes, but there's something bigger here, something we missed. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind them. Benton turned, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the figure emerging from the shadows. What is it, Sergeant? Benton asked, his voice carrying the same edge of impatience that had been present for weeks now. The sergeant approached, holding a small envelope. Found this on the floor of the study, he said, his voice tight, with uncertainty. It looks like it came from one of the drawers in the desk. Benton took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. He ripped it open, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. He read it quickly, his eyes flicking back and forth between the note and Miss Marple, before handing it to her without a word. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she scanned the paper. The note was brief, but it sent a chill down her spine. The game isn't over yet. The one you think you've caught is only a piece of the puzzle. Watch the shadows. The true mastermind is still at play. She felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. This wasn't Clara's handwriting. It was too neat, too controlled. Benton exhaled sharply. That's impossible. We have Clara. We know she was behind everything. Miss Marple shook her head slowly, her mind racing. No. Whoever wrote this has been watching us. They knew we'd find Clara. They're one step ahead. The sergeant, who had been waiting silently, spoke up. Should we go back inside? We can search the estate again. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, her eyes scanned the grounds, her mind already moving in new directions. A new plan, a new approach. Clara had been a part of the scheme, but she wasn't the only one pulling strings. There had been someone else, someone waiting in the wings, someone who had remained hidden behind the scenes. She felt it then, an old, familiar sensation creeping up on her. The feeling of being watched. But not just watched, monitored. The pieces she had missed before were starting to fall into place. Not yet, she said, her voice calm but firm. We need to go back to the beginning, to the first murder, to everything we thought we knew about this case. Benton's gaze flickered with confusion. The beginning? But Clara? Clara was a distraction, Miss Marple interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. She was part of the plan, yes, but not the entire plan. Someone used her to cover their tracks, to keep us focused on her while they remained in the shadows. They knew that if we caught Clara, we'd stop looking for them. But who? Benton's voice was strained. Who's left? Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She took a step forward, her mind racing through every conversation, every clue, every suspect they had spoken to. Then, as if a sudden light had been cast over the entire case, the answer came to her. I've been thinking about the letter, Benton, she said, her voice low but sharp. The one from the estate manager. It was too convenient. The look on Benton's face shifted. You think the manager? Yes, Miss Marple said. He's the one who had the most to gain. His ties to the company, the influence he had over Clara. It all makes sense now. Benton looked at her, eyes wide with realization. You think he's the one behind everything? But why? What's his motive? Miss Marple's eyes were already on the path ahead, her mind piecing together the final clues. The motive was always about power, Benton. Control over the estate, control over the people, and now he's going to do whatever it takes to keep it. They turned and walked back toward the estate, the tension rising once again. The game wasn't over. In Fact, it was just beginning. And this time, Miss Marple would be ready. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate as Miss Marple and Benton stood at the threshold of the grand door. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the moment. Everything had led to this. Clara's arrest, the notes, the cryptic letter, and the elusive manager who now stood as their prime suspect. All of it had led to this final confrontation. But even as Miss Marple's eyes scanned the familiar estate, she could not shake the nagging feeling that they had missed something critical, something too important to be ignored. "We're here, but it doesn't feel like the end," Benton said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. His hand was poised to open the door, but something in Miss Marple's expression kept him from pushing forward. "No, it doesn't," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "There's still one last piece." She could feel it in her bones. They had followed the trail of clues, connecting the dots, and for all intents and purposes, they had solved the case. Clara was the orchestrator. Her need for control had been exposed, her schemes laid bare. But in this profession, Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts above all else, and her instincts told her that justice had not yet been fully served. "Something's wrong," she continued, her gaze fixed on the door. "The truth is out there, but it's been twisted." Benton frowned but did not argue. He trusted her judgment implicitly. They both stood in silence for a moment, the wind whispering through the trees, before he finally nodded. "Let's go." Inside, the estate was eerily quiet, its vast halls echoing their footsteps. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, every corner hiding secrets that they were only just beginning to uncover. They moved through the grand hallway, their steps deliberate, methodical, until they reached the study, the epicenter of everything. The room where it all began. The place where Clara's first hints of manipulation had been uncovered. Now, it felt like the final battleground. They entered without a word, their eyes immediately scanning the room. Benton's gaze darted to the desk where the envelope had been found earlier, the place where they had thought they had it all figured out, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes didn't linger there. They moved over to the bookshelf by the far wall, her instincts telling her that the answers lay hidden in plain sight. "Look there," she said, pointing toward the shelf. Benton turned, his eyes narrowing. On the shelf, half hidden behind a row of dusty books, was a small, unmarked box. It was inconspicuous, too easy to overlook. Miss Marple crossed the room in 2 strides, her fingers brushing the box's cool surface. She paused, then slowly lifted it from its hiding spot, placing it gently on the desk in front of Benton. Without waiting for his reaction, she opened it. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a small, intricate key. It wasn't a key to a drawer or a door. It was too delicate, too ornamental, but Miss Marple recognized it immediately. "It's the key to the safe," she murmured. The safe Clara had been hiding her most valuable documents in. Benton's eyes widened in realization. "We thought it was destroyed in the fire." Clara wanted us to think that. She thought it would be the perfect cover-up. But this key wasn't just for her. It was for someone else. Miss Marple paused for a moment, turning the key over in her hands as though considering the full implications. "This is the key to something far more dangerous than a simple cover-up. The documents inside could change everything." Benton opened his mouth to speak, but just then the door to the study creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was the estate manager, Robert Clark, his face as cold and unyielding as ever. "Miss Marple, Benton," he greeted them with a tight smile. "I see you've found something." His casual tone sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. She didn't need to ask. She knew what this meant. He was the one who had been pulling the strings all along. Clara had been nothing but a pawn in his game. I believe you've been hiding something, Mr. Clark, Miss Marple said, her voice steady, but her eyes sharp. And it's time we uncover it. Clark didn't flinch. Instead, he walked further, into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Is that so? What exactly are you hoping to find? The truth, Miss Marple replied calmly. You've been using Clara as a distraction, haven't you? You manipulated her, made sure she took the fall for everything, all so you could cover your tracks. The tension in the room thickened, and Clark's smile faded slightly. He remained silent, his eyes calculating, but Miss Marple could see it in his face now. The cracks were beginning to show. She had finally cornered him. You know, I thought you were more clever than this, Clark said, his voice now tinged with a hint of disdain. But I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. Clara's done her part. You found what you thought was the key, but you've missed the bigger picture. Benton stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. What are you talking about? Clark's gaze flicked briefly to the key in Miss Marple's hand. That key? It doesn't matter. It was never meant for Clara. It was meant for you. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Me? She asked, incredulous. Clark's lips curled into a dark smile. You were always one step behind. You had all the clues, but you never understood why I let you find them. You were chasing ghosts, Miss Marple, and now you're too late. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door, followed by a voice she recognized all too well. Miss Marple, Benton, you'd better come quick. There's been another murder. Miss Marple's stomach twisted. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The walls had started to close in, and as the estate manager's face hardened with the realization that they were onto him, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Benton's voice was cold with authority. You'll come with us, Mr. Clark. We have questions. But Clark's expression remained unchanged. He knew something they didn't. Something far worse was coming, and Miss Marple realized with a sinking feeling that justice had not yet been served. The villain had escaped, not just with a key, but with something far more dangerous, the ability to disappear into the shadows once more. And as the door slammed shut behind them, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The estate was eerily quiet as Miss Marple and Benton made their way through the halls, their steps echoing against the cold stone floors. The night had settled in, and the wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows with a mournful sound that seemed to mirror the unease in the air. They had come so close, too close in fact, and yet the case still lingered like an unfinished symphony. The tension in the room with Clark had been palpable, and though they'd thought they were cornering him, his confidence had been unnerving. Something wasn't right. As they reached the grand entryway, Miss Marple stopped, her fingers brushing the edge of the staircase. Benton, already a step ahead, turned to look at her, a mix of confusion and concern in his expression. Miss Marple? He asked gently, his voice a sharp contrast to the silent weight pressing down on her. She stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. There's something I don't understand, she said, more to herself than to Benton. Why would he let us get this far? Benton frowned, stepping back toward her. Who? Clark? Yes, she said, finally turning to face him. Clark has always been one step ahead. He knew we'd find the box. He knew we'd find the key. He even knew Clara would be arrested. So why would he leave a trail for us to follow, only to leave us with more questions? Benton's face tightened as the realization dawned on him. He wanted us to follow the trail. He wanted us to find him. Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. But there's something more to it. He's playing a much bigger game, and we've only scratched the surface. Benton looked at her, trying to piece it together. So what's our next move? We wait, she replied simply. The next move is his, and we'll be ready for it. Just then, A voice interrupted their conversation. The assistant from earlier, a young woman named Emily, came rushing into the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple, Benton," Emily gasped. "You have to come quickly. It's the safe. Someone's opened it." Benton exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. This was it, the final act, the moment they'd been waiting for. With a sharp nod, Miss Marple gestured for Emily to lead the way, and they hurried down the corridor, the faintest spark of anticipation lighting Miss Marple's mind. The safe was located in a small private room behind the study, a hidden alcove no one knew about unless they were meant to. When they entered the room, they found the door ajar. The lock had been tampered with, bent out of shape in a way that wasn't accidental. The safe inside, however, was wide open, its contents emptied, save for a single piece of paper that lay on the floor. Miss Marple bent down and retrieved the paper, her brow furrowing as she read the message scrawled across it. It was a simple phrase, but one that sent chills down her spine. "You were right to follow the clues, but now the real game begins." Benton leaned over her shoulder, reading the words as she held the paper up. His face went pale. "What does it mean? What is he trying to say?" Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes lingering on the open safe. "I think it means we've been too focused on the wrong thing. Clark wasn't the end of the story. He was just the beginning. He knew we would follow the clues, but the real prize, the real secret, is something bigger than he ever let on." Her voice trailed off as she scanned the room, her mind racing. The mystery, it seemed, was far from over. "The safe," Benton began, his voice sharp with realization. "It wasn't meant to protect documents or valuables. It was a diversion, a way to lead us here." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing. "But to what end? What was in the safe that would lead Clark to believe we could find it? And why would he leave that message for us?" She glanced back down at the paper in her hand. For all their investigation, for all the careful planning and clues they had pieced together, there was still something they had missed. Something important. Before either of them could speak again, Emily came rushing back into the room. Her face was flushed and her eyes were wide with terror. "Miss Marple, Benton," she said, breathless. "It's Robert Clark. He's gone. Disappeared." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, darkening the already tense atmosphere. Miss Marple's heart sank. She should have known. She should have expected this twist. "Gone?" Benton repeated. "How? Where?" "He left a message," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "It's on the desk in his office. He's gone into hiding. He's not coming back." Miss Marple turned to Benton, her eyes hardening. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Together they followed Emily to Clark's office, where the door was ajar. Inside, the room was empty. Papers scattered across the floor. Drawers left open as if he had been in the middle of packing up. But on the desk was a note, this time typed rather than handwritten. "You were never meant to uncover everything. The truth you seek is buried deeper than you know. And when you find it, you'll wish you hadn't." Benton stared at the message, his fists clenched. "This is madness. It's like he's taunting us." Miss Marple, however, wasn't so sure. She looked at the note with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "He's leaving us breadcrumbs. Benton, he's letting us know we're on the right track, but now we need to think like him. We need to be ahead of him." But as they stood there, the silence pressing in on them, a strange realization dawned on Miss Marple. They had been so focused on the path before them, on the clues that had led them to this point, that they had failed to see the bigger picture. Clark wasn't the only one who had been playing a game. The mystery, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, it might never be. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Benton, and she could see that he too had come to the same conclusion. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning, another thread to pull, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become. The lingering question that had followed them all along now felt like an insistent whisper in Miss Marple's ear. How far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? And how many more mysteries would arise from this one? As they left the office, the shadows of the evening deepened around them, and the estate once again felt like a labyrinth, its mysteries growing ever more complex. The case had taken many twists and turns, and though it felt like the final curtain was about to fall, Miss Marple knew that it wasn't. Not yet. There were more questions to be answered. And somewhere, hidden just out of reach, was the key to unraveling it all. And so the mystery remained alive, breathing, and unresolved.